October 22nd, 1941 dawned cold and gray over the Winchester Repeating Arms Factory in New Haven, Connecticut, but inside the design room, history waited to be written. The United States Army had just designated Winchester's revolutionary prototype as the M1 carbine, a weapon that military planners believed would change modern warfare. Yet, within 3 years, this same weapon would earn a reputation as dangerous as any German bullet not from enemy action, but from the men who carried it, abandoning it on battlefields from Normandy to the Rhine. The story of the M1 carbine begins not with triumph, but with frustration. Throughout the late 1930s, American military officers watched with growing alarm as German blitzkrieg tactics rolled across Europe. Tank columns moved with unprecedented speed, paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, and the traditional concept of a safe rear area evaporated like morning mist. Artillery crews, truck drivers, radio operators, and supply sergeants' men who had always relied on pistols for personal protection suddenly found themselves in firefights they never expected. The M1 Garand rifle, that magnificent weapon General George Patton would later call the greatest battle implement ever devised, proved too cumbersome for these support troops. Weighing 9.5 pounds fully loaded and measuring 43 inches long, the Garand caught on tree branches during forest operations, knocked against helmets when slung, and prevented soldiers from wearing standard field packs comfortably. Moreover, the rifle's powerful .30-06 cartridge produced tremendous recoil that intimidated troops whose primary duties involved operating mortar or driving vehicles rather than engaging in sustained combat. Winchester's solution seemed elegant in its simplicity. They designed a carbine weighing just over 5 pounds, measuring only 35.5 inches in length, firing a specially developed .30 caliber cartridge with manageable recoil. The weapon used an innovative short-stroke gas piston system that made it reliable and easy to maintain. Its 15-round detachable magazine provided nearly double the capacity of the Garand's 8-round en-bloc clip. For troops who needed something more effective than a pistol but lighter than a rifle, the M1 carbine appeared to be the perfect middle ground. Production ramped up with astonishing speed as America entered World War II. Winchester led the effort, but the massive demand required an unprecedented industrial coalition. 9 manufacturers eventually joined the program: Inland Manufacturing Division of General Motors, International Business Machines, Underwood Typewriter Company, Rockola Manufacturing Corporation better, known for producing jukeboxes, and several others. By mid-1942, the first M1 carbines reached American troops stationed in the United Kingdom, with initial priority given to forces preparing for eventual combat in the European theater of operations. The weapon specifications impressed everyone who examined it. At $45 per unit, the carbine cost less than the $85 Garand, while providing semi-automatic fire that far outpaced the $26 M1911 pistol in effective range and accuracy. The carbine's .30 caliber round generated roughly twice the energy of the .45 caliber Thompson submachine gun cartridge, yet the weapon weighed half as much as the Thompson and allowed soldiers to carry significantly more ammunition. German intelligence services first learned of the M1 carbine's existence through captured American equipment in North Africa during late 1942. Their initial assessment, documented in the Kembel zur Fremden Gerds, the German military's guide to foreign weapons, reflected genuine surprise at the weapon's innovative design. According to military historian accounts, German ordnance experts initially designated the carbine as the Selbstladekarrenner 455A, meaning self-loading carbine number 455, American. They appreciated its lightweight and semi-automatic operation but questioned whether such a compact weapon firing a relatively low-powered cartridge could be effective in actual combat. As 1943 progressed, more American forces equipped with M1 carbines arrived in Europe and the Pacific. Standard Army infantry companies received allocations of 28 carbines, typically issued to officers, non-commissioned officers, forward artillery observers, ammunition bearers, and selected combat infantrymen. The weapon seemed destined for success, and by all accounts, the men who first carried it appreciated its handling characteristics. Then reality struck. December 16, 1944, arrived shrouded in fog across the Ardennes forest, where 80,000 American troops held an 85-mile defensive line they considered a quiet sector, a place for green divisions to gain experience and veteran units to rest after brutal fighting. At 5:30 that morning, the quiet shattered as 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks launched Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. Operation Watch on the Rhine, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, caught American forces completely by surprise. The massive German assault specifically targeted areas where American troops held thinly defended positions, and within hours Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units had penetrated deep into Allied lines. Confusion reigned as reports flooded headquarters describing German paratroopers dropping behind friendly lines, English-speaking German commandos wearing captured American uniforms, and armored columns rolling through supposedly secure rear areas. Private Daniel Morrison, an artillery observer with the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, 7th Armored Division, carried an M1 carbine when his unit encountered SS Kampfgruppe Piper near the small hamlet of Bognes on December 17. Morrison's battalion consisted primarily of support troops equipped with carbines rather than Garons, and they found themselves facing one of the most elite formations in the German military. The encounter lasted less than 20 minutes. Kampfgruppe Piper's armored vehicles and experienced SS troops overwhelmed the lightly armed American observers, who surrendered after expending their limited ammunition. Morrison and approximately 150 other American prisoners were disarmed and sent to stand in a field near the crossroads. 15 minutes later, SS troops opened fire on the defenseless prisoners in what became known as the Montmartre Massacre. Morrison survived by feigning death, lying wounded among the bodies of his comrades. Later, when questioned by military investigators, Morrison spoke bitterly about his carbine. According to American Rifleman research, he stated that he had scored multiple hits on attacking German soldiers who continued advancing as if the carbine's bullets were merely stinging insects. "I emptied 2 magazines into a German sergeant at less than 50 yards, Morrison testified. "I saw the impacts on his field jacket, but he kept coming and shot my lieutenant before our boys with Garons finally put him down." Morrison's experience was far from unique. Throughout the Ardennes offensive, American troops found themselves in the exact combat situations the M1 carbine was never designed to handle: sustained firefights at ranges beyond 100 yards against heavily equipped enemy soldiers. Reports flooded back to headquarters describing carbine rounds failing to penetrate German winter uniforms at distances exceeding 150 yards, bullets deflecting harmlessly off equipment and vehicle armor, and enemy soldiers absorbing multiple carbine hits before being incapacitated. The German 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by SS Obergruppenführer included some of the Wehrmacht's most experienced formations. Among them was the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, SS Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment, which had been given priority for supply and equipment. These elite troops wore heavy winter uniforms, carried extensive personal equipment, and possessed years of combat experience on the Eastern Front, where they had learned to fight through wounds that would have stopped less determined soldiers. When SS troops overran American positions during the opening days of the offensive, they captured substantial quantities of American equipment. Propaganda photographers from German units embedded with SS Kampfgruppe Hansen documented SS soldiers posing with captured M1 carbines during the offensive. These photographs later published in the book Nuts. The Battle of the Bulge by historians Donald Goldstein, Catherine Dillon, and J. Michael Wenger show SS troops running through Belgian villages carrying American carbines. However, military historians later determined these photographs were carefully staged for propaganda purposes. Jean-Paul Palade, in his comprehensive work Battle of the Bulge, Then and Now, examined the original German film footage and identified clear evidence of staging, including Belgian civilians casually walking through supposedly active combat zones while German soldiers performed for cameras. The photographs were intended for consumption back in Germany to boost morale by showing German forces seizing American equipment. The reality of how German forces actually regarded captured M1 carbines was far different from these propaganda images suggested. Sturmfähre Otto Skorzeny, the legendary German commando who led Operation Grief, the infiltration operation using English-speaking Germans in American uniforms, specifically rejected M1 carbines when equipping his special brigade. Despite desperate shortages of weapons and ammunition, Skorzeny's men preferred familiar German weapons or even pistols over the captured carbines. Wehrmacht ordnance officers who examined captured M1 carbines noted several critical shortcomings from the German perspective. The .30 caliber carbine cartridge used ammunition incompatible with any German weapons, meaning captured carbines could only be fired until their accompanying ammunition was exhausted. German logistics networks were already strained to the breaking point trying to supply multiple caliber types for their own diverse weapon inventory. They had no capacity to manufacture or distribute American carbine ammunition. Furthermore, German soldiers accustomed to the hard-hitting Karabiner 9.8K bolt-action rifle or the revolutionary Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle found the carbine's relatively weak cartridge inadequate for the brutal, close-quarters combat that characterized the Ardennes fighting. A veteran German Fallschirmjäger paratrooper captured near Mami later told interrogators, "We tried several of the American light rifles. They made good noise, but at 200 meters they were toys. We threw them away and kept our 98 kiloseconds." By December 21, 1944, the German offensive had pushed a dangerous bulge into Allied lines, but American resistance was stiffening. The 101st Airborne Division had rushed to Bastogne, a critical road junction town, and was now encircled by German forces. Despite being outnumbered and surrounded, the American paratroopers held firm, famously responding to German surrender demands with Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts!" The troops defending Bastogne included a mix of airborne infantry artillery units, tank destroyer battalions, and various support elements that had been swept into the perimeter during the chaotic first days of the German assault. Many of these men carried M1 carbines, and their experiences during the siege would prove instrumental in changing American military thinking about the weapon. Captain Thomas Wheeler, a company commander with the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, maintained a detailed combat diary throughout the Bastogne siege. His entries provide stark testimony about the carbine's limitations. December 23rd, Fritz attacked our position at dawn. Men with carbines emptied magazines at attacking Germans with little effect beyond 50 yards. Krauts walked through carbine fire like they were strolling in a park. Only when riflemen with Garans joined the fight did we stop them. Lost 3 good men today because their carbines wouldn't do the job. Wheeler's frustration grew with each passing day. December 24th, recommended to Colonel that all carbines be exchanged for Garans or at minimum Thompsons. Men are losing confidence in their weapons. Nothing worse for morale than pulling the trigger and watching your target keep coming. Several troopers have already scrounged Garans from casualties. The cold itself created additional problems for M1 carbine users. The weapon's non-corrosive primer ammunition, normally an advantage in preventing barrel corrosion, proved vulnerable to moisture in the damp, freezing conditions of the Ardennes winter. Soldiers reported misfires and failures to fire when moisture penetrated the primer compound and then froze. Garand ammunition, using older corrosive primers, proved more reliable in these extreme conditions. Meanwhile, German forces were learning that captured American carbines represented more liability than asset. When soldiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend Hitler Youth-Over elements of the 99th Infantry Division near Krinkelt-Rochereth during the offensive's opening phase, they captured dozens of M1 carbines along with several cases of ammunition. According to post-war interrogation records, the division's ordnance officer ordered the captured carbines collected and stored in a barn rather than distributed to troops. "Why would we give our men American toys when they have proper weapons?" the officer reportedly stated. The American carbine cannot stop a man wearing winter equipment at useful combat distance. It cannot penetrate vehicle armor or destroy equipment. It is useless for our purposes. The barn containing those captured carbines was destroyed during an American artillery barrage. 2 days later, The German ordnance officer made no effort to salvage them. Similar scenes played out across the Ardennes battlefield as German units encountered and captured American weapons. Research by military historians indicates that while German forces eagerly collected captured American Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and Browning machine guns, weapons they could use effectively until ammunition ran out, they largely ignored captured M1 carbines except for isolated instances where propaganda value outweighed practical considerations. On the American side, the flow of negative combat reports about the M1 carbine reached crisis proportions by late December 1944. The Ordnance Department, responsible for evaluating and distributing small arms, began receiving urgent requests from field commanders for additional Garand rifles to replace carbines in frontline units. These requests often came from officers who had previously praised the carbine's lightweight and handy characteristics. Major David Hartley, an ordnance officer with the Third Army, later wrote, "The bulge changed everything regarding the carbine. Before December, we couldn't supply enough of them. Every officer and NCO wanted one. After 2 weeks of fighting in the Ardennes, we were processing requests to turn them in for Garands or Thompsons. Men who had carried carbines for months were willing to shoulder the extra weight of a rifle if it meant having stopping power when it counted." The psychological impact of weapon failure cannot be overstated. Soldiers facing combat depend absolutely on their weapon's effectiveness. When that trust breaks down, when a soldier fires at an enemy and watches his target continue advancing, the result is devastating to morale and confidence. In the close quarters, desperate fighting of the Ardennes, where German and American soldiers often fought from positions just yards apart, weapon effectiveness became a matter of immediate life or death. As General George Patton's Third Army drove north to relieve Bastogne after Christmas 1944, they brought with them fresh divisions and much-needed supplies. Among these units was the 87th Infantry Division, which had recently arrived in Europe and was receiving its baptism of fire in the Ardennes campaign. The division's experience with the M1 carbine would become one of the most thoroughly documented cases of mass weapon abandonment in American military history. The 87th 347th Infantry Regiment had been equipped according to standard table of organization, meaning approximately 28 carbines per company distributed among officers, non-commissioned officers, and selected specialists. These men had trained extensively with their carbines at stateside bases and initially expressed satisfaction with the lightweight weapons. Combat changed their perspective dramatically. During the regiment's first major engagement near the village of Morici on January 3, 1945, Companies Easy and Fox assaulted German positions held by elements of the 5th Panzer Army. The attack began at dawn across open ground covered in deep snow. German defenders, well dug in and supported by machine gun positions, poured devastating fire into the advancing Americans. Sergeant Robert Martinez, a squad leader in Easy Company carrying an M1 carbine, described the attack in his post-action statement. "We advanced across maybe 200 yards of open field toward the German positions. I fired my entire 15-round magazine at a machine gun crew I could see clearly. Nothing happened. I reloaded, fired again, still nothing. The Germans just kept shooting. Meanwhile, guys with Garands next to me were dropping Germans with every shot. Made me feel like I was carrying a water pistol into a gunfight." Network, his interlocking fields of fire, his strategy of defense in depth, all of it was engineered to make capturing the island so costly that American planners might reconsider their march toward Japan. He'd succeeded brilliantly in the tactical sense. American casualties were mounting at rates unseen in previous Pacific campaigns, but he'd fundamentally misunderstood the American strategic objective. The United States didn't need to kill every Japanese defender. They didn't need to clear every tunnel or destroy every fortified position. They needed the airfields. Once Marines secured enough of the island to protect those airfields from Japanese artillery, once Seabees could repair and operate the runways, the strategic objective was essentially achieved. Everything else was simply finishing work. This represented a revolutionary approach to warfare that the Japanese military doctrine couldn't quite comprehend. Traditional military thinking held that you defeated an enemy force by destroying it, by overwhelming its defenses, by achieving total victory. But American industrial and logistical superiority allowed for a different calculus. The United States could afford to accept higher casualties in exchange for faster strategic gains. They could bypass and contain enemy strongpoints rather than reducing them through direct assault. They could achieve their objectives even while the fortress remained partially intact. According to strategic analyses conducted by military historians at the United States Naval War College after the war, the decision to proceed with the Iwo Jima invasion, despite understanding the defensive challenges, represented a clear-eyed assessment of acceptable costs versus strategic benefits. Every B-29 that landed safely on Iwo Jima represented 11 crew members saved. Every fighter escort mission that launched from the island increased bombing accuracy and reduced losses over Japan. The airfields were worth the price in American blood, however terrible that price proved to be. The Japanese strategy, by contrast, was ultimately self-defeating. By building an invincible fortress and committing every defender to fight to the death, Kurebayashi guaranteed that his forces would be fixed in place, unable to maneuver, unable to threaten American operations elsewhere. The fortress became a tomb of his own design. The tunnel network that protected his soldiers also trapped them. The strategy of defense in depth meant that once bypassed, positions couldn't be reinforced or resupplied. The Americans could simply contain and reduce these positions at their leisure while continuing to operate the airfields. By early March, this strategic dynamic had become obvious. The first operational B-29 missions were using Iwo Jima as an emergency landing field. P-51 Mustang fighters were being stationed on the island to provide escort for bombing missions over Japan. The Seabees had repaired and expanded the runways, built fuel storage facilities, and established the infrastructure necessary for sustained air operations. Japanese defenders still controlled portions of the northern island and continued fighting from their fortified positions, but they could no longer threaten these operations. The Marines continued their grinding advance northward, clearing defensive positions with flamethrowers and demolitions, sealing caves and bunkers, reducing the fortress piece by piece. But the urgency had diminished. The island was already serving its strategic purpose. The fortress that was supposed to be invincible was being rendered irrelevant even as it continued to resist. Kurebayashi understood what was happening. In messages sent to Imperial headquarters before communications were cut, he reported that American engineers were operating the airfields while his forces still held defensive positions. He described watching B-29s land and take off while he remained unable to strike at them effectively. The fortress had become a spectator to its own strategic obsolescence. This wasn't the first time in military history that seemingly invincible defenses had been circumvented rather than conquered. But it represented a new sophistication in American operational thinking, a willingness to accept that total tactical victory wasn't necessary if strategic objectives could be achieved through other means. The Marines would continue fighting and dying to eliminate the Japanese garrison, but this was as much about ensuring future security and establishing precedent as about immediate military necessity. The fortress was invincible. The Americans just ignored it, and in doing so they won. March 9, 1945. After 18 days of combat, the 5th Marine Division reached the northern coastline of Iwo Jima, officially cutting the island in half and isolating Japanese defenders into pockets. The fortress hadn't fallen, it had been dissected. What remained were islands within an island, fortified zones still connected by tunnels, still defended by soldiers who had no intention of surrendering, but no longer capable of coordinated defense or strategic impact. The cost of this achievement was staggering beyond anything American military planners had anticipated. By the time organized Japanese resistance collapsed on March 26, the United States Marine Corps had suffered nearly 26,000 casualties, 6,821 killed in action, and nearly 20,000 wounded. These numbers represented roughly one-third of the entire Marine force committed to the battle. Some individual units suffered casualty rates exceeding 75%. Every battalion commander who landed on February 19th was either killed or wounded. The casualty figures revealed the unique horror of fighting against Kurebayashi's fortress. In previous Pacific campaigns, Japanese defensive tactics, The emphasis on beach defenses and banzai charges resulted in high initial casualties, followed by steady reduction of enemy forces. Iwo Jima inverted this pattern. Casualties remained consistently high throughout the campaign because every defensive position required direct assault. There were no shortcuts, no clever flanking maneuvers, no way to avoid the grinding work of clearing fortified positions one by one. Medical personnel performed miracles under impossible conditions. Corpsmen crawled through fire to reach wounded Marines. Battalion aid stations operated within artillery range of Japanese positions. Hospital ships offshore handled a constant flow of casualties that strained their capacity. The nature of wounds reflected the close-quarters fighting blast injuries from grenades and mortar, burns from flamethrowers, gunshot wounds from firefights measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. Japanese casualties were even more catastrophic. Of the approximately 21,000 defenders Kurobayashi commanded, only 216 were captured alive, most of them too badly wounded to commit suicide. The rest died in the tunnels and caves, buried under collapsed positions, sealed in by demolition charges, consumed by flamethrowers, or killed in the final desperate counterattacks that marked the end of organized resistance. The fortress that was supposed to protect them became their mass grave. Kurobayashi himself disappeared during the final days of the battle. Multiple accounts suggest he led a final attack somewhere in the northern part of the island, but his body was never definitively identified. The commander who had promised to fight to the last man and defend Iwo Jima to the death apparently kept his word. The fortress claimed its architect along with everyone else. But numbers alone don't capture the human cost. Every casualty represented a family receiving a telegram, a community mourning a loss, a life cut short or permanently altered. The wounded Marines who survived faced years of recovery, many carrying shrapnel fragments that couldn't be removed, suffering from burns that required multiple surgeries, bearing psychological scars that 1940s medicine barely understood and couldn't effectively treat. The American public, reading newspaper accounts of the battle while watching the famous flag-raising photograph become iconic, struggled to reconcile the image of victory with the staggering casualty lists. Political pressure mounted as the full cost of taking Iwo Jima became clear. Military leaders found themselves defending the decision to assault the island, arguing that strategic benefits justified the losses. The debate would continue for decades. Was Iwo Jima worth the price? From a purely strategic standpoint, the answer was yes. By war's end, more than 2,400 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima, representing approximately 27,000 aircrew members saved. Fighter escorts flying from the island significantly improved bombing accuracy and reduced bomber losses over Japan. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders seeing American bombers operating from an island that was supposed to be an invincible fortress was immeasurable. The capture of Iwo Jima shortened the Pacific War by demonstrating that no Japanese defensive position was secure. But strategic calculus feels obscene when measured against individual tragedy. Each of those 6,821 killed Marines had a name, a story, a life that mattered beyond operational analyses and casualty statistics. The fortress extracted its price not just in lives lost but in futures erased, the children never born, the achievements never accomplished, the ordinary human experiences never lived. For the Japanese defenders, the cost was total annihilation. Kurobayashi's strategy of fighting to the death meant that his fortress became a sealed vault, a place where 20,000 men went to die with virtually no possibility of survival. Unlike other campaigns where soldiers could retreat or surrender, the defenders of Iwo Jima were committed to remain until death claimed them. The fortress wasn't just invincible from the outside, it was inescapable from within. April 17, 1945. Less than a month after the flag-raising ceremony officially declaring Iwo Jima secure, military analysts from all branches of the United States Armed Forces descended on the island to study what had happened. They walked through the tunnel networks, examined the fortified positions, interviewed survivors, and compiled detailed reports on Japanese defensive tactics and American assault techniques. The fortress, even in defeat, had lessons to teach. The most profound lesson was that defensive engineering had evolved faster than assault tactics. Traditional amphibious doctrine bombardment, landing, advance assumed that firepower could neutralize prepared defenses. Iwo Jima demonstrated this assumption was dangerously outdated. No amount of naval gunfire or aerial bombardment could destroy an enemy that lived underground. Future operations would require new approaches, specialized weapons for bunker warfare, better intelligence gathering to identify tunnel networks, tactics that emphasized containment and isolation rather than direct frontal assault. The Marine Corps studied Kuribayashi's defensive philosophy and recognized its sophistication. His abandonment of beach defenses, his emphasis on letting attackers establish a beachhead before engaging, his use of reverse slope defenses and interconnected positions, all of it represented advanced military thinking that contradicted traditional Japanese tactical doctrine. Staff officers noted that Kuribayashi had essentially invented modern defensive warfare, fortifications designed not to hold territory but to inflict maximum casualties, defense in depth with no expectation of reinforcement or relief, complete commitment to a war of attrition. These lessons informed planning for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan's home islands scheduled for November 1945. Military planners anticipated that Japanese defenders would employ the Iwo Jima model on a massive scale, tunnel networks in the mountains, fortified positions covering every beach and approaches, a garrison willing to fight to total annihilation. Casualty estimates for Downfall reflected this assumption, projecting hundreds of thousands of American deaths and millions of Japanese casualties. The fortress of Iwo Jima, multiplied across Kyushu and Honshu, promised carnage beyond comprehension. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 made Operation Downfall unnecessary. Japan surrendered without invasion, and American forces occupied the home islands peacefully. Historians still debate whether the decision to use atomic weapons was justified, but the specter of Iwo Jima inevitably shadows those debates. Would American political will have sustained an invasion promising Iwo Jima-level casualties week after week, month after month? Could democratic nations prosecute wars of that scale and brutality indefinitely? For the Marines who survived Iwo Jima, the lessons were more personal and immediate. They'd learned that courage alone wasn't sufficient against prepared defenses, that technological superiority meant nothing against an enemy willing to die in place. That victory could be achieved even at costs that seemed unbearable. Many struggled with survivors' guilt, the question of why they lived when so many didn't, whether anything could justify the losses they'd witnessed. These psychological wounds proved as enduring as physical injuries. The fortress also taught lessons about the limits of military doctrine and the danger of preparing for the last war rather than the next one. Japanese strategic thinking emphasized honor, sacrifice, and defense of every inch of territory. This doctrine led directly to the Iwo Jima strategy: build an invincible fortress and force the enemy to pay an unacceptable price for worthless volcanic rock. But American strategic flexibility, the willingness to accept high costs for valuable strategic gains, the ability to bypass and ignore the invincible fortress while achieving operational objectives rendered that doctrine obsolete. In the decades following World War II, military theorists studied Iwo Jima as a case study in both defensive excellence and strategic failure. Kuribayashi had built the perfect fortress and implemented a flawless defensive battle. Every tactical decision he made was correct. His forces performed exactly as planned, inflicting maximum casualties while utilizing terrain and fortifications with masterful skill. And yet he lost, because tactical perfection couldn't overcome strategic irrelevance. The Americans achieved their objectives, secure the airfields, project air power toward Japan even, while the fortress remained partially intact. Modern military doctrine reflects these lessons. Special operations forces trained for tunnel warfare. Bunker-busting weapons were developed specifically to address fortified positions. Military planners emphasized maneuver and strategic objectives over direct confrontation with prepared defenses. The fortress of Iwo Jima stands as a monument to the danger of assuming that strong defenses alone can achieve strategic goals. For the Japanese military and nation, Iwo Jima represented something even more devastating. Proof that Bushido valor and willingness to die couldn't overcome material and technological disadvantages. The fortress that was supposed to demonstrate Japanese martial superiority instead revealed the futility of sacrificial defense. Every Japanese soldier who died in those tunnels, all 20,000 of them, died without changing the war's outcome. The fortress guaranteed their deaths without guaranteeing strategic impact. The lessons written in the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima remain relevant 8 decades later. They speak to the relationship between tactics and strategy, the limits of defensive warfare, the importance of strategic flexibility, and the terrible human cost of conflict. Today, November 28, 2025, 80 years after the battle's conclusion, Iwo Jima remains an active Japanese military facility, closed to general tourism but open to veteran pilgrimages and official commemorations. The tunnels remain largely intact beneath the volcanic rock. A tomb containing the remains of thousands of Japanese soldiers whose bodies were never recovered. The island stands as both memorial and warning, a reminder of what humans can achieve through engineering and courage, and what they destroy through war. The fortress of Iwo Jima changed military thinking in ways that extended far beyond World War II. During the Korean War, Chinese forces employed similar tunnel tactics in the hills north of the 38th parallel, creating defensive positions that proved nearly impossible to assault directly. American forces, remembering Iwo Jima, adapted their tactics accordingly, bypassing strong points when possible, using massive firepower when direct assault was necessary, accepting stalemate rather than pursuing Pyrrhic victories. Vietnam presented another iteration of the fortress concept. The Viet Cong's Chi tunnels and the elaborate defensive networks throughout South Vietnam echoed Kuribayashi's philosophy: let enemies establish presence on the surface while the real war is fought from underground. American forces struggled with these tactics just as they had struggled on Iwo Jima, learning once again that technological superiority provides limited advantages against determined defenders fighting from prepared positions with nothing to lose. Modern military conflicts continue wrestling with the fortress problem. The tunnel networks beneath Gaza represent a 21st-century evolution of Kuribayashi's concept's defensive infrastructure built over decades, interconnected positions that allow fighters to appear and disappear, strategic depth that renders bombardment ineffective. The technological sophistication has increased ventilation systems, electrical power, communication networks, but the fundamental concept remains: go underground, connect everything, make the fortress invisible and ubiquitous. The human legacy of Iwo Jima proves even more enduring than the military lessons. The battle produced 27 Medals of Honor, more than any other single engagement in American military history. 22 of these were awarded posthumously, reflecting the extraordinary sacrifices required to overcome the fortress's defenses. The names of the recipients, John Basilone, Douglas Jacobson, Jack Lummis, and so many others, remain honored in Marine Corps lore. The famous flag-raising photograph by Joe Rosenthal became the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. The bronze statue of 6 men raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi stands as perhaps America's most recognized military monument. Millions of visitors annually see the image without necessarily understanding the context that 3 of the 6 men in the photograph were killed before the battle ended, that the flag raising occurred only 4 days into a 36-day campaign, that the mountain beneath their feet was honeycombed with tunnels containing defenders who would fight for weeks after that banner was raised. For Japan, Iwo Jima became a symbol of sacrifice and tragedy rather than military virtue. Post-war Japanese society struggled to reconcile the courage of the defenders with the futility of their mission. Kuribayashi himself became a tragic figure, a general who understood his enemy, who fought brilliantly, who demanded maximum effort from his soldiers, yet who led them all to pointless deaths in service of a war that was already lost. His letters to his family, discovered after the war, revealed a man who understood the likely outcome but fulfilled his duty anyway.